Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what is the second round in our wonderful series on industrial strategies, organized jointly with our friends from DIW Berlin and also hosted at DIW Berlin. We started with one of the biggest conundra in industrial policy last time. How can you reconcile trade, fair trade, and industrial policies? And we are staying bold today, and we are looking at competition and how that interacts with industrial policies. So public transport has essentially broken down in Berlin, but the fact that so many people have made it to our conference and are still coming in shows how interesting and also relevant the subject is. As usual, we're going to work with a secret weapon from Paris, the OECD, and experts from the ground. But before we do so and have our panel discussion, I'm delighted to introduce the DIW expert on competition policy, also heading the Monopol Commission here in Germany, Tommaso Duso, who can tell us what competition policy can do for innovation and how to reconcile it with industrial strategies. Tommaso, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. Thank you, everybody who made us to come. 10 years ago we were used to this kind of winter in Berlin. Now not anymore. So my daughter didn't manage to come to school, but I managed to come here, like you. And I'm really happy of this second dialogue on industrial strategy. We started in December, and today we will talk about the interplay between competitiveness and competition, or more in general, market dynamism and its implication for policy. And I'm particularly happy to have the chance to introduce the topic, because I've been working on this alone and together with a group here at the DIW over the past 2 years. We had a discussion in Brussels last week or 2 weeks ago with DG ECFIN on this. Last week with Ori, we had an interesting discussion on how we should adapt merger policy to these issues in Brussels at the OECD. So this is very topical. And my central argument will be that we do have competitiveness challenges, and I will show you a couple of graphs. But that we also have challenges about the state of competition in Europe, and that if we want to solve these challenges, we should revert to competition as a fundamental principle, as a driver of competitiveness for a new and coherent and coordinated European policy approach. So I want to start with some facts, and of course one cannot start a discussion on competitiveness without citing the Draghi report. The Draghi report shaped every discussion about competitiveness in the past two years, and shaped also the policy of the European Commission. So Mario Draghi, among many things, provided some compelling evidence that European member states are losing their competitiveness. After a century, and now I realize the graphs are very small, but I hope you can see it. After a century where the gap in productivity growth between the US and Europe was getting closer and closer, this gap is now widening again. And of course, as always, everything is much more complicated. That is not true for every sector, but that is the tendency. We also see that the GDP growth gap between Europe and not only the US, but now also China is increasing. But maybe even more challenging, we see that Europe is not investing, especially is not investing in innovation, and especially in those sectors that are particularly central for increasing competitiveness and productivity. And this is partly due to the fact that firms, especially the high growth SMEs and innovative firms, have difficulties to secure sufficient financing. One of the graph in the Draghi report that is more telling to this is this one showing the gap in venture capital investment at different stages between Europe and the US. And it's there at every stage, but it's particularly true for later stage. So yeah, we know this, we innovate, but we have difficulties to scale up. And since publication, the situation has worsened. I couldn't imagine that 2 years ago. I thought it was pretty bad, but now it's even worse, especially due to all this geopolitical tension that has been growing, and we discussed it in December about that. So we do have challenges with competitiveness, but we also challenges with competition, and that is something that has been less discussed in the public domain. So a few months before the Draghi report was published, DG Competition published this report, Protecting Competition in a Changing World, that was putting together 3 different reports, one by the OECD, the team around Chiara Criscuolo, one by an international consortium led by Lea and ECA. I see some people from ECA also here, was involved, and I was one of the senior academic advisors. And so I want to show you a couple of figures from this report because they show that actually the situation of competition in Europe is also not super healthy. So what we see in Europe, as in many other parts of the world, is concentration is increasing. Right, it's increasing in many markets, in many sectors, and essentially in almost all countries, with differences, but it's increasing. And this is especially true in industries that operate at the national level, and we see it at the industry level, but also at the market level. And of course, there are many drivers for this increasing concentration. Some are more technological, the rise of intangible and the rise of dynamics that lead to the creation of larger firms. But there are also barriers to entry, regulatory barriers to entry. There are also mergers and acquisition, and also a lack of enforcement of merger policy. So increasing concentration can be bad and good. It can be just the effect of efficiency gains. As some firms become super efficient, they gain market share, and therefore concentration increases. But they can also be bad, and it's difficult to disentangle where this is the case. So in the study, in the report, we provide some case studies trying to understand how the relationship between concentration and market outcome is. And of course, it's difficult, but for some sectors, we had very good data and also good identification strategy, as we say. So a good way to see whether the relationship between market structure and outcomes is a causal one. And this is the mobile telecommunication. And it's important because the Draghi report talks a lot about mobile telecommunications, saying we need consolidation. What we show is that in mobile telecommunication, we still have national markets, and an increase in concentration is not good for the outcomes in that market. We show that one additional mobile network operator reduces prices by 7%, but also it increases investment, and that is completely against the mantra of big telcos saying that actually they need to consolidate to do more investment, right? So that is not what we see in the data. So we also see that, as in many other parts of the world, not only concentration is increasing, also markups are increasing. And again, so maybe a bit less than in other parts of the world, but is an increase that is substantial, especially at the top of the distribution. And this primarily took place in digital intensive industry and in services. So, but what is maybe the most problematic trend that we see is that market dynamism is decreasing. So we have decreasing entry and decreasing exit from markets. And that leads to an increase in the productivity gap between frontier and non-frontier firms. We have incumbents that manage to stay in the market and gain market shares, and the distance between these more successful firms and others is increasing. This decreases the introduction of new technology, makes more difficult for younger, more innovative firms to enter in the market, and this reduces the innovation capacity of many sectors. So we have problems regarding competitiveness, we have problems regarding competition, and now the next question is, but are they related? And actually, we know, going back to the giants of the field, that actually competition is a driver of competitiveness. And also there, in the report, we try to provide evidence for that. One thing that a team did, I was not involved in that part, was to use a macroeconomic models to understand what would be the impact of competition on macroeconomic outcome. So they use this macroeconomic model, they use data that we estimated, especially the markups, to calibrate the model, and then they made some simulation. So in the backward simulation, they simulate what would have been the GDP in Europe if we didn't observe this increase in markups that we observe. And they show that the GDP would have been higher by 5 to 7%. In the forward-looking simulation, they simulate what would happen if we cut the distribution of markups, we cut the top of the distribution. So we take away market power from the firms, right? So, and interpret that as, if you want, a more active competition policy. And they show that this would increase GDP by 2 to 4%. And of course, this is a macro model. I am a microeconomist. There are a lot of assumptions. One can ask how robust this piece of evidence. Then another team look at a very different form of evidence. They asked 400 firms active in exporting sectors in Europe. What do they think that is the role of competition for their success abroad? And 80% of these firms say that competition at home is increasing their innovation, their productivity, and the quality of their products. Some are very sure about that, some are less sure about that, but 80% find competition at home as a driver of their competitiveness. And these resonate with many pieces of research, and I give one from my own research in a paper in the Review of Economic Statistics some years ago. We showed that a better competition policy, better enforcement, but also better rules, increase productivity growth significantly. And the more so in sectors that are less regulated and where institutions, legal institutions in country where the legal institutions are better. So there is plenty of evidence that competition and competition policy have a positive impact on competitiveness. Now, what are the policy implications? And if you listen to the debate in Europe, but also in Germany, very often there is a tendency to say, but actually we need national champions. We need to relax competition and competition law to have to increase competitiveness. And I think that would be not the right way to go. I think that what we need is a new coherent approach where competition is a guiding principle to design several tools that should be coordinated and possibly at the European level. So perhaps the most important thing that we would need now, and we discussed it already in December when we talked about trade, would be to complete the single market. Again, one of the issues that we face is that we don't invest and we don't innovate. And one part of the story is that for many firms, especially for startups, the market is too small. So having a broader European market for services would be really important for this firm to scale up. We also need to reduce regulatory uncertainty. For a startup in Germany to start, they will face different regulatory regimes in other countries. So a coordination of regulation and harmonization of regulation or regulatory tools across Europe would be very important. It would be very important to finally have a banking capital union so that firms have access to capital, which is not the case at this time. And we also need structural reform. So there is mounting evidence that show that restructuring costs, exit costs in Europe are much higher than in other countries. And this is an hindrance for firms to do risky investment in drastic innovation because they know that it will be very difficult to lay off the people that are hired to implement this innovation. So we need that too. And of course, we need a tough competition policy. I show you some evidence. Actually, competition policy should not be used less intensively than in the past, in the contrary, but it should be better. It's true that competition policy in the past was very often focused more on dynamic definition of the market, more focus on prices. So I think there is room for improvement. We discussed it a lot last week in Paris. And one of the main issue in merger control should be that we should focus much more on dynamics, on innovation theories of arm. We should think much better how to think about efficiency, especially dynamic efficiency, when we analyze mergers. We need much more speedy and efficient antitrust. It's very slow. If you look at the case against big tech, it took ages, 5, 6, 7 years to close the cases against Google or against Amazon. And of course, in markets that evolve very dynamically, that doesn't make any sense. And the same is for state aid, although we have seen that actually the Commission is able to be much speedier and more efficient when it comes to exceptional situation. What we also need is to coordinate competition policy tool with new tools that have been implemented in the past 2 years, the DMA, the foreign subsidy regulation. That would be a very important tool in the future, especially thinking about competition between European firms and firms in other parts of the market that are not following this multilateral approach, accepting equal rules for everybody. But of course, competition policy can solve some problems, but cannot solve all the problems. We have plenty of market failures that need some other intervention, and therefore I think that we do need an industrial policy or industrial strategy that is addressing this market failure that comes from coordination costs, externalities. If you want even resilience can be seen as a market failure, right? So, but then we have to think which kind of industrial policy we need. And there is also there plenty of evidence that shows that some industrial policy tools work, but they work best in markets that are competitive. Philippe Aghion, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics this year, is one of the people who have shown a lot of evidence about this. So the kind of industrial policy that we need is competition-oriented. So we don't want politicians to pick the winner. We want politicians to support the best. So the allocation of resources should be done according to competitive tools, mechanisms like auction, private procurement. They should be open also for smaller firms and not just for the incumbent. We also have to think about the impact of each of these tools on competition in the market afterwards. And that is exactly what state aid control is doing. The balancing test is balancing the solving of a market failure with the costs in terms of reduced competition, and that is could be the basis for a modern industrial policy. It should be much more strategic. We have not been very strategic in the past, and now we need to be strategic and focus on those infrastructure that is central and on those technologies that are at the base of many value chains. Because there are spillovers, there are externalities that can be integrated. So if we think about semiconductor batteries, these are products that are relevant for many value chains, so maybe it makes more sense to support this kind of technologies. And it should be European. We still have, and that is something that Mario Draghi mentioned many times, we still have national industrial policies. We don't have an European industrial policy. And we need to coordinate because the challenges that we face are global. And there are some examples, like the important project of Common European Instrument is not a true European policy, but is the basis on which industrial policy could build. And it should be evidence-based. So we should learn much more. So we think about issues like sandboxes, so trying out different design of the policy and experiment which one works more, or evaluation, ex-post evaluation, that should be carried out to understand fact-based what has worked and what's not, and what is working should be continuous and what doesn't work should be stopped. And I stop too. I look forward to our discussions. And so. I stay.
You don't disappear. And well, thank you, Tommaso, for a great introduction. And now I'm going to call two more experts to discuss with us on the panel. We have Markus Hess, very lucky to have him from the Ministry of Economics and Energy now, and he's Deputy Director General at the Industrial Policy and Future Mobility Directorate. Welcome to our discussion, Mr. Hess. And I promised... I can't even, he's there. Yeah. I promised a secret weapon from Paris, of course. And this time it's Uri Schwarz. He's heading our competition policy division and is actually very passionate about this interaction between competition and industrial policy. Welcome, Uri. Yeah, and well, Tommaso gave a very passionate plea for competition policy and how important it is, right, Uri, and that must have pleased you a lot. But well, until his last slide, I thought, oh, gee, he's somehow peddling around the trade-offs or the difficult questions. In the end, he didn't. But I would like to ask you, because well, he said he made it very clear: competition policy is very important for productivity growth, for competitiveness, etc. But then, in industrial policy, we are trying to promote the green transition, for example. And we have sectors like steel or also mobility, where some solutions that we think will help us to get there are not yet market ready. So there are subsidies, there's debate about subsidies among OECD and other countries. Well, how do you see this element of industrial policy? Should it not even be there? Can it be handled with a sunset clause? How do we reconcile this with the competition policy, competition that's so important for productivity growth? Ori.
First, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and perhaps a word of courage and encouragement to our audience, our in-person audience, who made the bold decision to leave their homes this morning and come here in this weather. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for being here. Yeah.
And also, it's really not fair to talk after Tommaso, because there's not much left to say, but I'll try nonetheless. So I think, generally speaking, we have many forms of industrial policy, and we tend to say that industrial policy is back, but I would like to question that and wonder whether it was ever gone. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it just took different forms, and perhaps today it's becoming more explicit. Mm-hmm. Also, governments are not shy to say, again, explicitly that they are using it, but I would dare say that they were never gone. They just took other forms. And those who don't believe me just can have a look at the agricultural sector, for example, as a clear example where basically industrial policy was always there. The beginning of I think Tommaso touched upon heavily the issue of innovation. Mm-hmm. And clearly, I mean, just to set the scene, I would say that there's nothing wrong with government intervention in the economy. Governments often do so, and in the context, but they need to have a clear idea in their minds what they're looking to achieve. And innovation, I would say, probably is a very good objective. Mm-hmm. And clearly, there is often a market failure around innovation. Firms, for some reasons, certain contexts, do not invest enough in innovation, and there's a good case for governments to intervene. Just going back in history, some of the greatest inventions in human history were done through strong support, sometimes even the initiative of governments. We sent man to the moon, largely with the strong push and innovative of a government. And around that, so many new innovation took place. Mm-hmm. But how to do that rightly, and now I'm going back to your question. First, we need, again, to have a clear perception of what we're doing. What's the problem we are aiming to solve? And I would say focus on the what, not the who. So what is the problem, not who should solve it? And this is often the case when we see governments seeing one single firm that is sometimes can be too close to government, sometimes even owned by government. Mm. And then governments try to see how they can find something for this firm to do, and then bad things may happen. I think one other thing that we should bear in mind, you mentioned subsidies, and we may touch up this topic later, I understand, is basically one additional form of industrial policy. It is perhaps the most explicit one, because it's also the most visible one, which I think also is good in a sense, because at least with subsidies, you know who's getting what, to how much. But as you were implying in your question, it tends to be very sticky. Once firms tend to rely on handouts by governments, they build their business model around it. And then where governments try to take a step back, things may become complicated, especially if these firms employ a lot of labor. Mm-hmm. Then it may lead to labor tensions and political pressure, and then subsidies stay long after they should have gone. So I think that in this sense, perhaps the clear solution would be to have sunset clauses, indeed, to take a final, to the extent it's possible to take a strong commitment, not only to give subsidies, but to withdraw subsidies at a certain point, but letting everybody know in advance so the commitment is reliable.
Does that work?
Well, it's easier said than done. I think it can work. Of course, you can find good and bad examples. I mentioned earlier the agricultural sector, which is not often the one which is being mentioned in this discussion. And there, of course, this is an example of a sector that has been living for many, many years in, I would say, most countries, not just in Europe, with different level of support from government. Perhaps it's essential. Perhaps there are other reasons that for which you need to support this sector in the longer term. But yeah, it's difficult. But if these policies were easy, we wouldn't have to have this discussion, right?
Markus Hess. So in the it's very. I mean, for economists, it's very easy in some ways to talk about sunset clauses or really nicely designed instruments. One example I think we admire a lot from your ministry are the climate contracts for difference, where there's really an inbuilt mechanism that a subsidy turns into a non-subsidy, let's put it this way. At the same time, you're as, in a ministry, as policymakers, you're confronted, and perhaps at this moment, more than at other times, perhaps daily, with these pressures that come from, well, big companies, employment that might be lost, right? And I said it before, so your department also looks into the future of mobility, and that's perhaps very apparent at the moment in Germany. So the car industry is very important. It provides a lot of employment, but it's also in a big transition, right? And in a transition that has many of the elements that Tommaso mentioned about industrial policy. So you need infrastructure for e-mobility. You perhaps also need subsidies, visible and less visible. In Germany, for example, I understand the subsidies or the tax reductions for company cars are very important also to determine how a new car model can develop. So is it possible to design these industrial policy instruments in an innovation, competition-friendly way when in your daily work there are all these pressures and you clearly don't want to lose a lot of employment when something is transitioning fast in industry?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to elaborate a little bit on that. Mm-hmm. Because as you've rightly mentioned, in the end it's about jobs, right? So when you look into the industry, to have workforce, to be able to work as an employer, to have employees is something that is in their mind, but it is nothing without a product that is competitive on a certain market. Mm-hmm. So to subsidize, for instance, a company that would, or a sector that would offer something to the market that is fairly outdated technologically from the votes and no longer possibly competitive at national or international market would be something I would make a bet you don't find in the German federal government's policy any longer. Mm-hmm. That has been in the 60s for Western Germany, that was there to bring up and to save the amounts of workforce you had back then, but not today. What is at the core today from the industrial policy point of view, it's do we have a technological edge there that has to be reinforced or to be supported, not in terms of subsidy, that is an instrument, but has to be supported to get market ready. That is something we were talking about. My personal experience from the semiconductors and the batteries part is a mixed experience. If you look at semiconductors, we're now we started to open up supporting schemes. IPCIs were mentioned in 2015. That was the first microelectronics IPCI that was offered to the market participants to participate, and it took an awful lot of time to convince them to participate. It was not the question about where's the money for me, the respective company, but it was a difficult thing to get those companies to join those kinds of European approach. Had to do with dissemination and spillover effects that are mandatory for joining such a scheme. But in general, that is or has been at that time a crucial or perhaps particular German thing. Companies do think that companies from their respective sectors are competitors you don't talk to, but you have to fight. So to bring them together in one funding scheme, where the funding part is not the problem, but the scheme was the problem. They had to join forces to develop something that was in their common interest, had a possible spillover effect into their sector, into the market, and the European aspect. That was the big thing. But that's history. Today and last week we had the close of 2 IPCIs, one of advanced semiconductor technologies and the other of AI. They are potentially hugely funded, right? So, but they were 10 times overbooked, 10 times.
Oh, yeah.
So the companies understood that coming to a new technological level only works if you join forces. And then there is something that I've learned, I'm so far lectured by those who do the practical work, over-compliance. Companies fear to come into conflict with competition law. And so they do nothing. And the instruments we offer, that the European Commission has given the green light to offer to the market, are a unique opportunity for them to do something in public together that is not against something they feel is a restriction from competition law.
Well, that's interesting. But just one question. Would you say the fact that these IPCIs work better now than they used to 10 years ago, is that the pressure, the geoeconomic, geopolitical pressures, or is it more the feeling that you're lost in front of new technologies like AI? You really need to join forces.
My personal experience is split. If you look at the German landscape, you're always talking about big companies and the SMEs, our famous Mittelstand. So that is something that is not so common in Europe. So the other split experience is that other companies from other member states have no problem in joining such a scheme, because they instantly understood that getting to a higher level in technology-wise would not force, but they felt nudged at least. And money was a factor for sure, but they felt that it's a good idea. In Germany, we hear cut red tape, loosen the framework conditions for all of us, and give us more space to breathe, and then the rest is up to competition, because we are it's our core business to be competitive. And that is something that is true for SMEs as well, in particular the larger ones that have not 100 employees, but 2,500, something like that. And for sure the large companies. So from my experience today, I have no problem in convincing them, in particular not in when it comes to AI-related issues, or semiconductors, or battery cell production, or battery cell research.
Tommaso, that was surprising in a way, no? To hear that, well, their companies are over compliant. You said antitrust policy is not strong enough, but do you see the other side of the coin too? That in some very areas with big innovation, companies should perhaps team up, and they don't because they're afraid of the sword of competition policy.
I mean, that argument is an argument that we heard a lot in the past. When 3 years ago, 4 years ago, the discussion was about sustainability. No? So it was a different world. Nobody could imagine that we are in the state that we are now. And both at the European level and at the national level, there were some movement to say, okay, so we could relax some rules, or we could make some exceptions. And I remember a few years ago a panel discussion with the Bundeskartellamt, so the German antitrust authority, telling nobody comes. No, I mean, we give them the opportunity to come and tell us why they want to come together, but then they have to be very explicit what is the goal, the what, right? So, and nobody came, right? So now, again, so I think, and that is where I really changed a bit my mind over the past few years. We are in a different world. And I think that what is happening now, especially in high-tech sector, is also a reflection of this new world. Firms understand that it's vital to survive, especially in sectors where there is a lot of competition, in the sense that there are giant firms that are expanding their ecosystem and monopolizing an entire sector, right? So the only option that Europe has is to come together. So, and again, so and there is not so clear how much cooperation you need and how much a single firm can manage to be disruptive alone and grow. But I mean, one point in the discussion we had in Paris was, I think nobody would have anything against mergers between startups and scale-up in Europe. Nobody. We might have problems with merger when Google and Facebook and so Meta and Microsoft are buying up startups, right? So that kind of cooperation is something that can work. Now, cooperation for innovation is also something that is a possibility, and I think that is exactly the idea of the IPCI, to bring these people together. It should be European. It should be along the value chain, right? It's not just one segment of the tax stack. You want to create all these externalities that come because you have products that are compatible and so on. So I think it's a way to go, and maybe it is true that some firms were scared, but actually also I cannot imagine how that is possible, because what we need are the smart startup and scale up, and these firms. I'm not really convinced that they were stopped by competition law, right? No. So, but again, a clear signal to say, so don't be scared. If you come and have a good idea, we have a scheme according to these objectives. You are allowed to cooperate. I think is the way to go, and I completely agree with you. So nobody knows actually whether the IPCI that we had until now worked or not. Actually, more not than yes. But at least the idea is a good one, and everybody is hoping that the new generation will help us, especially in those sectors.
Uri, you come, not only are you a competition policy expert, but you come from the startup nation. So you know about, and we were talking about being in a new world. One area where certainly Europe and Germany are in a new world is also the perceived military threat and the need to be self-sufficient. So budget rules have been relaxed a lot to spend a lot more for the defense industry. And I can see very little positive about this change in the world. But perhaps one thing, so both the Silicon Valley, but also the startup scene in Israel, if I understand correctly, are sort of a spin-off product of a lot of investment into the defense industry, right? And they generated a lot of innovation and also spillovers to the non-defense sector. Is this a possibility if Europe now spends a lot more into defense? Because here we are all wringing our hands and say, well, this is consumption, it's not for the future, it's not innovation. So could it give an innovation push? And if so, what are the conditions for that?
Well, I'm not an expert on that, but I'll try to answer nonetheless. I think that we see often that there are synergies between the defense industry and the civil industry. I mentioned earlier the race to the moon, which started as a sort of military operation, let's call it, but also delivered a lot of benefits, a lot of innovation as a kind of spillover indeed in other sectors. And in this sense, Europe is now seem to be going in a direction, well, perhaps not for good reasons, but is forced to take a direction which puts a lot of emphasis on defense, that pushes Europe to invest much more on defense than it used to in the past. And the spillovers are there. Having said that, I think the principles are more or less the same principles as with any other government intervention. And since we're mentioning, I think it's particularly interesting in the defense sector, because in the defense sector, it's typically the government who's at least the biggest spender. I mean, typically private firms do not buy fighter jets and tanks. I mean, in most countries, and the government as a buyer has the power to make a difference. And there's an interesting analogy here with procurement policy, because of what there is a very long-standing theory about how to use, and we in the OECD have been doing a lot. We started, by the way, with fighting bid rigging in public procurement, and then developed a body of knowledge about how to turn public procurement into a pro-competitive tool. And the government, as a big spender, especially in this industry, have the power to reshape markets to the bad or to the good, and of course to improve the competitive structure of a market by, for example, promoting level playing field, by making sure that when, for example, through procurement, it also provides an opportunity for smaller players to participate. It doesn't only focus on the big players, perhaps on the state-owned players. So again, I think it's even a bigger opportunity for governments, considering that they are already there. They don't have to, if they are planning to spend money on defense, and it seems that they are planning to spend money on defense. It's not so much about making this decision that was already made. That it's usually very complicated to spend more money. These decisions were made. Now it's only the how. Make sure that while doing that, you have competition in mind, of course, together with other important public objectives.
Markus Hess, this instrument, so we indeed at the OECD, we write and think a lot about public procurement as an innovation policy or industrial policy instrument. But I don't think it's very developed in our member countries. So I'm just curious, is that one of the levers that you look at when you think about, well, how can we develop AI or the future of mobility? The state has a big lever there, should be part of the toolbox?
Well, I feel tempted to say the core argument to ramp up spending in defense was not the technological aspect.
Of course not. No.
And I don't say that you said it, but just to make sure the outset. But where does the big spender has a lever? I think if you look, for instance, today is a good example for Berlin because it's a crackdown in public transport. Electric buses, for instance. When you take a company that is providing public transportation, and they have to have a lot of buses in their fleet to make sure that the lines are served. They had to be nudged to procure electric buses because they were at the beginning 6 times, now it's 3 times more expensive than the internal combustion buses. So why, from a purely economic point of view, should a company that is providing a bus service forego the procurement of 2 buses just to buy one that is 3 times as expensive as the 2 ones they could have bought additionally? So, and that is where the nudging, the incentive, the thinking of a transition and transformation of a sector kicks in. So because from a purely economic point of view, they wouldn't do that because they have to calculate a fleet has 100 buses. We have a dropout rate of 20%, just a given figure. So we have 120 buses to have, just to have all lines served. So why should I? And then comes what I've said initially. But that is not a transitional thing. That is a purely well understood economic point of view, which I totally understand. Without our funding schemes to come to a new level of technological possibilities, those buses would be up to until today up to date, perhaps 5 times as cost intensive as they were initially. Now it's 3 times because we've created a market that wasn't there before. But that scaled up the production, and economy of scales kicked in that respect. Without the public procurement, that would have perhaps happened, but not in that amount of time. We can overlook retrospectively. So yes, I'm totally advocating for things like that because in the end there is a transition in the mobility sector, but in the car sector as well, but also in other sectors where automation, for instance, has to be scaled up to a large extent to counter a balanced demography. If you have less staff in the years to come to do the work that is more or less analog, how it's figured, how it's structured, then you get in a problem because you have to raise up wages, but perhaps in the end you don't get a person because they aren't there. Immigration perhaps helps, but not to that extent that you can fit the entire economy. So automation, again, that is, to my understanding, the role of the federal level of a state, at least, is to nudge all those who have to factor those developments into their company strategy, not to pinpoint them and tell them they have to do this and that, but they have to prepare themselves for the time that is down the road in 5 years, in 10 years' time, a reality. And then they have to deal with it. And then they come to us and say, well, where's the solution? I don't have it because 10 years ago, we were ready to support all of you to come up with a good idea how to cope with that. But today it's simply impossible for the public part of society to make up for the strategic errors, mistakes they did. But we have a role and we can play it. And if you look at the corporate fleets, it's the same, in a different shape.
Well, yeah, so now I have a batch of questions on digital for Tommaso. Thank you. But also there should be a reward for having braved the weather today. So after that, you're the experts in our in-person audience are invited to ask their questions. And I just realized that we promised last time that we were also going to look at the digital questions, but we have to postpone that to next time. Tommaso, so we're back now with, a brilliant, first of all, example of how public procurement can stimulate innovation when we move away from the price as the only or the main competition element in public procurement. But if I think about digital and what you said before, isn't that a very complicated world to be? You said, well, the Google cases were so lengthy, antitrust is not what it should be in Europe. But, you know, the digital markets can be so big, global indeed, that in a world that is less cooperative, is it possible to make sure that competition thrives and survives in markets with big networks of effects like the one that you have? Can you have in digital markets?
Yeah, no, we have 3 hours, no? Also when we talk about digital markets, that is it's very broad,
yes,
right? So, but it's and it's also not super clear to define. We have very different services and value chains and so on. But we have in mind something. What are the digital companies? We know that we have the big tech, so we say the big tech, and I think again. So if you look back 10, 15 years ago, everybody said, "Oh, it's great. It's great company, they are innovating, fantastic, you know, all these efficiencies, don't stay on their way, let them grow," right? And then at some point, people started having mixed feeling. You know, it was 2015, 16, and there were some cases. I mean, the first were the Microsoft, and then everybody started realizing, well, maybe competition policy in the digital space didn't work out too well, right? So we didn't stop any merger. There was no remedies. And I remember, I mean, we were doing a study for the CMA, analyzing merger control in digital markets, and we look at case studies, Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, Waze. Many of these cases where we realize ex post, maybe we would have done things differently, right? So that was merger control. Antitrust, the same. So we had these cases going on, Google Shopping going on, 7 years? And then, so Google was went over and over and add new conducts and so on, and the fine didn't bring much. So we moved to thinking to regulate. It took us 3 years to have the Digital Market Act, the Digital Service Act, and they are there, and I'm happy that they are there, because we realize only ex post with these companies that are so powerful doesn't work. In Germany, 19A, the new article in the competition law is very similar. It's different. It's still competition law, but it has a taste of regulation. And now we realize maybe also that is not enough. If you have companies that anyway they do whatever they do. I mean, 2 years ago, so 1 year ago at the inauguration of Donald Trump, you had the tech bros sitting there, and so Mark Zuckerberg going to Trump 2 weeks later and say, yeah, you know, so the European Commission just want to hit the glorious American company. And now the discussion is moving to another level that is in the line of this discussion about procurement. So there is this initiative, the Eurostack, that is saying, you know, we don't need the money, we just need demand. We just need the certainty that our investment will bring something. And again, so we are not used to thinking that way. So buy European technology, buy just European cloud. But it is a new world, a world where our allies of 50 years are not maybe so trustworthy anymore. So maybe that is the third layer. So, you know, competition policy, regulation, say industrial policy, or which form we will have to see. Because at the end, we are talking about technologies that are at the base of our economy in the future, so the digital stack. So we talk about resilience, strategic autonomy. So I think the discussion move at that level, and I have the feeling that that is what the Commission is doing. Is something that the new government also is pushing. The new Minister for Digital Infrastructure, so he's talking about the German stack, which makes me a bit crazy because I say, how can you talk about the German? Talk about the European stack and try to do these things European. It's a difficult thing. But I think so. These are the three layers, which doesn't mean the competition policy is dead. On the opposite, so I'm still hope. So we have two big cases, one in Europe and one in the US, Google Ad Tech cases, and everybody is waiting to see who is doing the move, because Margareta Vestager said at that time the only remedy for this case is the breakup, right? And so the Commission said gave a fine of 1.6 million. To Google and said
billion.
Billion.
Not million.
Millions.
Million, billion, right? So, and come up with the remedies. Google came up with some behavioral remedies, and now we are waiting. And I think everybody is waiting to see whether the court in the US does it, because there is this process this trial going on, because everything has become so political. Imagine the Commission now asking Google to break up in this political situation. I don't know. So I think that it will be a mixture, but indeed, so digital is one of the areas where we will need a mix of tools. And the point is that these tools should be coordinated. We have to see that the different policymakers that are in charge of each of these tools talk to each other, which is, if you want, a all of government approach. And both at the level horizontal, so the different policies, but also at the level of the member state. And I must admit, I don't see it. I don't see it. Nor in the Commission, I don't see it between the member states. And I think that if one message was the center message of Draghi was that just do this thing together and try to join forces, because without doing that, you will be doomed. So we will see.
We will see. And for sure, Joanna, she had problems with the YouTube, but did make it here, and she was waving her hand. So you have the first question from the floor, Joanna.
Thanks very much. Joanna Bryson, Hertie School. I'm in the Center for Digital Governance. Thank you very much for the panel. It's great. I have two very quick comments and two quick questions, and it all kind of merges together. One comment that's totally separate, but just about this automation thing, speaking as someone out of the AI policy area. Really, please talk about how do we take the people who are here, even if there's fewer of them, and make them more productive instead of talking about replacing people with automation. That was a quick comment. The other comment, though, is back to the Tommaso's talk. I was really interested in this thing about the dynamism of the market, and that's partly because my PhD student at Leonard Baum has shown that in China, the big intervention that they made in their GAFAM version, looking over the paper, we've had to resubmit it again, and there were some inconsistencies about what the impacts had been, and I realized all the impacts had been on the behavior of the investors. So there've been no consequences for the large companies when when the government kind of weighed in on them. Their market value stopped going up, but their profits were constant, so they were not harmed. But at the same time that their market value stopped going up, then also there was these additional entries that happened. So it's as if the investors, so just showing a willingness to enforce may be enough to do some of that market renewal. And so this came to my question, which I've now forgotten. Right. So there's two questions I had. One was this thing about when we do go to having a more concentrated market, it seems to me that's what brings open the regulatory capture problem. And it's almost like we have to do these oscillations between more concentrated and then more split up again or something. And I was wondering if this relates, so this is my big question. So the one question is just, could you say something about the regulatory capture issue of too much concentration? But the other was that when your issue about the scaling capital. So the one part of innovation, and again, you know, I've worked documenting the IP that have been generated in tech. It's big in Europe. But the one issue, as you said, is scaling capital. Mm-hmm. But that's also just a really weird superpower of the US, right? The scale of the money that almost makes it seem unreal, the capital markets. And so I'm wondering, is that real? Is it a distortion? What is really happening with with the valuation of what is being injected into the hyperscaling stage of investment?
Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to give it to you, Ori, so to the extent that you want to talk about it. But one, it's interesting, right? The regulatory capture, important for you. But also then, we have the US with all the money going into it. But I said there's the smaller market of Israel. Maybe you can shed some light on it from there also. So is financing, scale-up financing, Europe's huge problem, or are there other issues? Let me put the question that way.
Maybe I'll take the first one first about the capture. I'm not sure that this was. I mean, I think Tommaso described very accurately kind of the change of mood within the competition enforcement community between, I would say, 10, 15 years ago and today, when at the beginning there was a lot of enthusiasm, because, I mean, to be honest, some of these firms brought a lot of competition to many different industries. And then at a certain point, realized that the picture is perhaps a bit more complex. Just to be fair, there were no regulators regulating these industries. There's no sector regulators for digital. At least there were not such regulators in the past. And as it is often the case when there's no sector regulators, but have competition authorities are forced to take a bigger role when compared to what they should. And to me, it's not so much the regulatory capture of this sector, but the fact that digital markets have long list of unique characteristics, like you mentioned earlier, network effects, but also vertical integration, and there's the role of data, and a winner takes it all kind of dynamics, and many others. And what's interesting about them is, first, that none of these characteristics are unique for digital market. Second, I cannot think of any other industry that have all of them together. And that leads to us in competition, on the competition policy side, really had to look back at our theory, at our tools, and reflect whether these theories and tools are fit for purpose when it comes to digital markets. The mere notion, probably the most basic notion of competition enforcement and policy is a market definition. But market definition is usually the first step of enforcement, but market definition in digital markets is very different. And if you don't have the tools, you may drop the ball, and perhaps you can go back to some of the decisions not to act that were mentioned earlier by Tommaso. So, me, it's not so much about the regulatory capture, but the need to adapt. And of course, once you adapt your theory, you sometimes need to adapt your rules. Courts need to adapt, usually quite conservative. It takes time. It's a long process. We have the processes that, again, Tommaso mentioned, the very, very, very lengthy cases that took years after years after years. And we need to bear in mind there's also a big gap in resources. And when an authority puts all its resources on one major case, things are happening elsewhere that perhaps the authority doesn't have the resources to deal with. Finally, going back to the second question, and perhaps I could give the floor to the other speakers because I'm not expert on that, but obviously, I mean, from my own personal knowledge from my country, startups, when they become serious, they go to the US because capital is in the US. and I think the Draghi report highlights very clearly that as long as Europe doesn't have one capital market, it would be in a very difficult position to compete with US capital markets.
Yeah, maybe I think I have two questions here, but maybe I can turn to Markus Hess about that too.
Wait, cut it short. Exactly this.
Exactly. Good. Yeah, that's very concise. Thank you. I think I'm not sure, Carsten. Did you have a question too? Yeah, and then I have one here. Yeah.
Carsten Neuer from the Climate Policy Department here at DRW. I'd like to follow up on this question, coordination, that Tommaso brought up. And I think you had a nice example, bringing the man to the moon is clearly coordination where we want to achieve something. The coordinated procurement in Israel or California on the IT perspective. The very long-term coordinated manufacturing strategy of China, which succeeded in batteries, PV, automotive developments. And then we are discussing industrial strategy, and our response on the panel is we need tenders, one-off tenders. We need always think of avoiding lock-ins and kind of sunset clauses. My sense is what we need is credibility that there is a market development over the next 5 to 10 years if I've got a good project. And this is what I really wonder, why we don't look at this coordination challenge and why we don't learn from best practice globally. Innovation targets that China put up and announced for 5, 10, 15 years ahead of time. Why don't we have an innovation target for clean manufacturing processes? Saying now, in the next 10 years, we want to have 10, 20% of primary manufacturing of clean materials in Europe. And then we have tenders year by year, and I know the market is growing, and I can innovate in Europe into these technologies. Why don't we look at progress transformation indicators to really make individual tenders actually credible and relevant for investors?
I think, Markus says, I want to give it to you and add a little bit, because, well, it sounds like, when I see the reflexes in German economic policy discussion is, oh no, that's central planning. That's one thing. But then another difficulty I would see is, if this is interesting, if this approach can be interesting, it would be the entire European market too, right? It would be difficult. Wouldn't it be difficult to coordinate? What do you think about this approach? Basically, planning into the future, saying this is where the market is going.
Not to be misunderstood, but when there's one thing the European Union is able to manage, then it's coordination. Yeah? Because there are so many member states, so many processes, so many ideas, and so many different strands of action that have to be coordinated by at least someone, and there are pros in that respect. But you're right. You're right in a certain respect. We've tried it with the hydrogen grid. Yeah, we tried to give some ideas to the market that in 10 years' time from now on, and coming from the climate change, goals, and break down some kind of development which is not related to milestones, but companies are free to see that there is an end and there is a goal and there is a kind of support out there. But to be honest, and perhaps I'm from the wrong ministry in that respect, but to put it the other way around, you can guide the horses to the well, but they have to drink themselves. Yeah, that is not from my side. It's a famous word from one of our former economic affairs minister, Karl Schiller, and he coined that, because in the end, because there is a failure out there, the first thing that happens is to coin it as a market failure. When it's a market failure, all eyes are on the state to fix it, and not on the market participants to come up with a viable solution or with a, let's say, competition-based offer to the market to solve it. I live from subsidies. Perhaps I'm the subsidized human being in itself, because as an official you are subsidized from the taxpayers. But we have a lot of funding schemes in place that only work because there is money in there that incentivizes or nudges companies to join in, to come up with an idea, and in the end to bring innovation to a new level. And that we move on, that we will continue to do. But to a certain extent, and I've been doing that for more than 10 years now, I would have loved a little bit more, let's say, energy seen by market participants to come up with something, at least to try whether they are, from a competitive point of view, able to place their product in a market that perhaps they create themselves. And the famous quote for that is, before iPhone, there was no market for iPhones. And today we're talking about something someone invented by sheer will of entrepreneurial risk-taking. And that is also part of our everyday's life when we talk about subsidies. It's not only all eyes on the state, but perhaps a little bit, at least the half of your eyes, on the companies.
Thank you. And before I move to my other question from the audience, I'm curious what you think about Carsten's proposal. I'm sure you've discussed it internally, so now we want to know.
Yeah, we should discuss more often, but that is also why we have this kind of thing. So I must say, I tend to agree on this idea that we need a strategy. We don't have a strategy, and that is why we chose to call this dialogue industrial strategy. And to have a strategy is not easy. I'm not as optimistic as you are to think that the European Commission really managed the coordination.
You should have more trust.
Yeah, maybe I should have more trust in the Commission. But I do think that having a strategy means to decide what you want to do, but also what you don't want to do. And that is the difficulty, right? So the difficulty to say we choose the path to climate neutrality and we stay with that, or we choose a path to electric vehicle and we stay with that, and we coordinate with the other countries in Europe to have to give a framework that decreases a bit the incentive to innovate. But I am also completely with you. I have the feeling that in Europe, in many member states, firms lost the entrepreneur spirit and take risk. And maybe it's also one reason, I mentioned it at some point, one reason is that it doesn't pay too much to take risk in Europe because it's too costly. Again, with this, there is this evidence on the cost of restructuring and exit in euros up 3 times as than in the US. That means if you take the risk to do this new crazy investment and change the technology that you adopt in the firm, and you hire 100 new engineers to do that, and it fails, then you have to pay for 3 years. It takes 3.5 years before you can lay off these people. In the US, it takes 3 months. I'm not saying that that is where we should go, but that is maybe also an explanation on why we have lost a bit this willingness to take the risk. So I think that requires even more coordination to rethink about the framework on which we operate, which is a mix of structural reforms, maybe a bit more planning and strategic choice of which kind of technologies or technology path we want to see as the objective. And then I still believe we should have competitive tendering for that. And again, I like a lot what the Sprint with agencies for disruptive innovation is doing in Germany. So they don't say what they want, they say what is the goal, and then ask firms to come with idea to reach that goal. And that is a kind of policy I would like to see that maybe then is stimulating also innovation.
Perfect. Now we have a question here, no? And please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jana Svetjev. I'm from the University of Sydney, but I'm currently visiting at the Jacques Delors Center of the Hertie School. And my question actually is a related one. So I think that I work on experimentalist competition law, and one of the problems in competition law, of course, when you kind of try to be more dynamic in your thinking, is the difficulty of predicting dynamic effects in an unstable environment. And in industrial policy, you have a similar problem of kind of trying to essentially assess whether the benefits that you were trying to achieve through industrial policy are actually being kind of, achieved. And so that's one of the reasons to move to things like, sandboxes or, sunset clauses to evaluate ex post. But my question to the panel is it possible to effectively evaluate from one project? Are you actually learning sufficiently from one project to be able to evaluate whether it's achieving its objectives, or whether, the kind of the hypothesis that you had about dynamic effects is in fact, coming into, is eventuating? So if you take the example of the, of the electric buses, you might ask the question, well, was that the right strategy in the first place? And second of all, even if it was, are the benefits that are being delivered through the policy actually kind of, cost effective, and are there better ways to deliver them? So I'm just wondering whether one of the reasons that you might want to kind of think about competition, even in the design of industrial policy, is because you actually need differentiation in order to be able to learn. Otherwise, you're kind of locked into one learning project, which may or may not, in fact, be a good one.
Oh, yeah, I start with you, as I often do. Evaluating competition policy and industrial policy, how do you do it? How many projects do you need? Does it help you to have many different countries and look across those different projects?
I think your question touched upon many different, you can take the answer in many different directions, but I would like to start. I also already wanted to comment on the buses example, which I really liked, I must say. Because it seems to me that it's more about the balancing of what governments are for, what they do best, and what the market is for, and what the market does best. The government is about setting policy objectives. And yeah, this is why we choose politicians, because, in theory, because we like their policies. And if the policies is making sure that public transportation is greener, it seems to me like an absolutely fair policy. And how to do that? This is where markets perhaps can do better and come up with better solution. It's not necessarily for governments to dictate the exact solution for the market on how to innovate and then scale up this solution. It's about, again, achieving what seems to me like a very good balance between policy decision and kind of market execution. And it would have been great to have 100 different kind of these policy experiments and come up at the end of the day with clear assessment on which one is the best. But I guess in reality, you have to achieve a lot of policy goals in parallel, and you do not have the opportunity to experiment in that way like you have perhaps in academia. But I would say, again, from what I've heard, and I don't know much about it, but from the description I heard from Markus, that seems to me like a very good direction.
Very good, thanks. You want to add, yeah?
I mean, it's a very valid point, but that is exactly the idea of the sandboxes, to have the same policy goal and 2 or 3 different tools that are experimented and then compare, right? So that is what the European Commission imposed to state aid control a few years ago. They asked for any kind of state aid, the entity that is giving out the state aid should come with a plan, how they plan to evaluate this tool and ex ante, right? So, and again, so I think that the more we embed this logic in all the policy we have, the more heterogeneity we will have that will be needed then to evaluate what worked and what not, right? But of course, especially for new technologies, it's difficult, right? And it's something we are not very used to in competition policy, but we should accept a bit more uncertainty and learn to deal with that. But then having this rule, Alexander, this sunset rule to say, we try with this policy and then we try to see what came out. And first we say after 3 years, that's over. And then we can think again. I know that it's not the kind of horizon you would like for the big investment, but it's not saying the goal is not what we want to reach, but so this specific tool, we try to see where it works, and else we have to adjust it, right? So I think it's the way to go.
That's one. Okay, I was just going to say, one last question, and otherwise I think we're standing, between you and the light or the continued discussion at lunch, but please.
I'm the obstacle to lunch. Ansel Mattes, EC Economics Consultancy here in Berlin. A question on procurement of military products and competition within that procurement. You discussed that earlier, and I imagine, sure, we need to create a bigger market, a true European market. That makes all sense. But I imagine that designing competition in procurement of military products is more difficult than other products. So you have that confidentiality issue, I believe. So you have these long-lasting projects like a new generation of fighter jets or a new tank generation. This is for 30, 40 years. And I imagine specifications need to be confidential because, otherwise the people you want to fight with it can simply Google what you're using. And also spillovers are very difficult because of that confidentiality issues. Also, you have rising network effects. And essentially that means you're having a competition for the market for one product, but that's it. And you're stuck with that for 30 years, or for 40 years, and you don't have competition in between for individual products. And I imagine, so introducing more competition into this kind of market is really difficult. So how to do it? And maybe
in 2 minutes. But so that's a very relevant question, and I think it extends to other areas, because the hiccup that we had in Berlin earlier this month, right? The blackout, right? There was a discussion about, because network providers are, I think, required by law to say basically where these connections are that they were damaged. So I think it's a wider issue also in critical infrastructure, etc. You said the tension between transparency, basically, that you may need for competition, and then that may make you vulnerable with your critical infrastructure. I'm not sure we have a military sector expert here. Does anybody want to volunteer to answer the question on principles? Perhaps?
Yeah, very generally. Obviously, I think in every procurement process, in every policy decision, there are different considerations. And I won't try to say, just drop everything else, focus on more competitive markets. But just have competition in mind as one other consideration, another issue, one other policy area you need to consider. And for example, when you have to, I can imagine in procurement related to defense, you need to also take, to make sure that you don't give your defense contracts to firms that are not reliable. But having said that, once this is settled, bear in mind that you also need to take care of competitive markets. So again, you don't necessarily get to this lock-in effect when you are stuck for 30 years with the same firm.
Well, brilliant. I think that's a good closure for our official discussion, but we have an unofficial discussion going on in the next room. And And to my online audience, I promise, I think we will convene again when in March or April. Our dialogue series will go on, and next time we'll be prepared to take questions also from the online audience. Thanks to everybody who made it here, to everybody who listened online, and in particular, thank you to my wonderful panel.